Well, hi there, everybody. I'm Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com. Thanks for tuning in today. It's almost election day, but of course, it's already election season. A lot of people have voted, will be voting in person, absentee balloting, but then a lot of people will be showing up on election day. And in the meantime, there's millions of dollars being spent by both sides for advertising and voter turnout. So it's a good time today to talk about the top election issues. And brought to you by AARP Wisconsin, we're doing this virtual luncheon today on the top election issues. First, I want to tell you about a couple things at WisPolitics.com. You can find our virtual election guide. And there's a link at the website, tells you about the top races. And, from the governor's race all the way down to the legislature. And you'll be able to go to WisPolitics.com, of course, on election night for our election coverage. So please tune in there and on our social media, including Instagram now, to follow the election results. We also have a post-election event already set up on November 10th at UW-Milwaukee, where we have a top panel that will discuss the results of the election. But today, we're going to talk about the top issues facing voters. And we have an all-star panel here. I want to welcome Jessie Opoien from the Capital Times, Matt Smith from UpFront on WISN-TV, and we're partners with UpFront, and Professor Mark Copelovitch from UW-Madison and the Follette Institute, or the Follette School of Public Affairs, as I'm supposed to say. So I think I got that right now, right, Mark? Yeah. Okay. All right. You can always correct me because I need a lot of correcting. All right. Well, let's just start with Jessie. I mean, wow. This for a midterm election, this is heated. There's going to be high turnout. There's all kinds of messaging going on. But what do you see, from you talking to voters and the campaigns and viewing the polls? What do you think are the top issues that are driving voters in this midterm election?
Well, I mean, I think what we've seen in every Marquette poll throughout, this race tracks pretty well with what voters are thinking about, and particularly the breakdown between parties. If you look at Democrats, abortion is way at the top of the list for things that they're, focusing on, concerned about, talking about at campaign events. And you look to Republicans and independents, and it doesn't even crack the top 5. It's things like crime, inflation, again, the things that you're seeing ads about, but things that actually kind of, smack you in the face every day when you go to fill up your gas tank or go to the grocery store. And, you don't need to be reminded about a lot of those things.
Okay, Matt, what are you seeing out there? What's driving voters?
Yeah, so I think the question is, when you look at these campaigns, right, and you look at the messaging they're taking, are they driving the polling, or are they looking at the polling and taking that and then driving their message, right? Because if we look at Republican rallies, if we look at Republican events, it is what Republicans are most focused on, right? Inflation, crime, taxes. Democrats have put all of their eggs in a basket, at least up until the last couple of weeks, on abortion. Nationally and here locally, there have been some Democratic strategists who have worried that maybe that was too much to focus on this one issue, especially when you look at independents. And one of their main concerns is inflation. You have this middle ground here in Wisconsin, right? Not that anyone maybe has not made up their mind at this point, but you have these people, whether they're going to vote or not, and you have independents saying that inflation is the biggest issue when they go to the grocery store, when they go to the gas pump. And Democrats have at least attempted to shift their message, it seems, on inflation. Both Republicans and Democrats are trying to find their footing on what is a winning message on inflation, when that is the top concern, at least among the broad general public and independent voters.
Okay, Mark, what's your view?
Yeah, so I think Jessie and Matt know more about the sort of what's going on with the polls and voters, but I studied the politics of the economy, and so when I look at numbers like this and see such vast partisan differences, I start to think about what's driving them, right? Because it's unlikely that people's material experience of things like inflation is very different, and yet voters have such drastically different rank ordering of these issues. And so I start to think about things like media coverage. I've been doing some research with Mike Wagner at the journalism school on kind of media coverage of public opinion and inflation. And it turns out there's been about 10 times as much media coverage of inflation versus, unemployment or the economic recovery, lots more discussion of recession. And obviously, as we know, one of the things we know about public opinions and political science is gas prices are huge when you think about politicians' approval, and it tracks very, very strongly. And but I'm really struck, as just sort of as someone who studies the economy, that the economy is doing really, really well compared to where it was 2 years ago. And the average household's income, when you adjust for inflation, is about the same as it was in March of 2020, right? And yet, inflation and all these things are so salient. And Matt sort of hit on it. I think that's what you see on a daily basis. Right? You see the price of vegetables in the supermarket. You see the gas price when you fill up your car. But it is really striking and interesting to me as a political scientist that there's this huge disconnect of which issue. I think the party's campaign strategies that Jessie and Matt mentioned is part of that, but I also think there's a little more of it about what people have heard for the last year and a half about what are the big problems in society.
Okay, I want to stay with this. So this is maybe recency bias, or as I think pollsters have disdainfully called it, garbage in, garbage out. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What people see most recently is what wow, yeah, that is. Or if they see it repeatedly, then, you can't deny that there's inflation, but I guess.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's garbage in, garbage out at all. I think some of it is recency bias. I think some of it is framing effects of, we sort of, most coverage of the economy focuses on what's wrong with the economy, and that makes sense, right? Because there's sort of, and inflation has massive distributional consequences, right? People at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale are hit much harder than people at the higher end. And so there are huge distributional costs. And if you think about parties having different coalitions in different part of the state, different people are hit harder by inflation. But again, I also think most voters aren't following economic policy very closely, like someone like me does on a daily basis. So again, as we were talking about, what you see is gas went up and now it is, $4.50. It used to be $2.50. I don't think people process that gas was actually higher in nominal terms in 2012. Right. And voters weren't concerned about inflation at the level they were. So again, to me, that's a really interesting disconnect of why that is, right? Because gas prices are back down now below where they were in 2012 and 13, and people weren't worked up about inflation, but they weren't hearing about it, and they weren't seeing it in the wake of a major economic crisis. So I think the way we process information then is very different.
All right, I want to go to Matt, because Matt, you talked about that the critics are already out that the Dems had the wrong strategy, and that there at least should have been more sympathy expressed by Democrats, for those who are worried about inflation. Tell us, I heard this also from a Democratic organizer in the Valley, who said, I said, well, what's the top issue up there? He said, the economy and inflation. Yeah. I said, well, what about abortion? He said, economy and inflation. I said, what about climate change? Economy and inflation. Yeah. So
I had a political, someone with the campaign said to me the other week, and it makes sense. Just think about how many times you see gas prices in a given day. It is the thing that slaps you in the face when you are driving around. You can't avoid seeing it. You see it likely multiple times a day in terms of voters. And that is just something that is in your face constantly. That's why we saw Republicans, right? When they were collecting signatures, they were doing it at gas stations. Brian Stiles had this tour where he was collecting signatures on the ballot at gas pumps saying, how much are you paying? How much does it cost to fill up your tank? Here, sign my nomination papers so I get on the ballot. And here's the Republican plan on inflation. I think Democrats, I've had some nationally say, listen, we did not do a good job of selling what Democrats in Congress and what the administration did and how that is flowing down to the local level, whether you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which Democrats heavily support, or the infrastructure bill, for example. They said we kind of forgot about that, right? And for Democrats, that was some of their crown legislative accomplishments. And the messaging, some of them feel got lost and hidden in where they could have, and are attempting to a little bit at this point hone in on what Democrats are doing for the economy, as opposed to just all the bad things we hear, and Republicans saying we're going to change it. Whether that happens or not, obviously, is in the eye of the beholder.
Okay, so Jessie, is this late pivot? Is there enough time to make it, or are you hearing the same kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. I mean, Matt and I were both at the Obama rally in Milwaukee, and that to me was really one of the first times that it seemed like there was messaging about what's going on in Washington that it can benefit people here in Wisconsin. That Barack Obama didn't walk away from things like inflation or crime. He didn't try to pretend they didn't exist. He embraced it, and he said, yeah, these are real issues, but which party do you think is going to do something about it in a way that really benefits you? I think that was an effective message, but I do wonder if it's too late. I mean, a lot of people have, certainly made up their minds or started voting, or, maybe it's too late to motivate them. Obviously we'll find out, and I've given up on trying to predict anything, but, it struck me that that was a very different message, and one that it felt like was much more effective than a lot of the things that we've been hearing in the last few months.
Jessie, I know you talk to people, and I went around and talked to voters, and I was just curious, not only on the economic message, but the Obama visit itself. I asked him, does what former President Obama say, does that resonate more than Mandela Barnes or Tony Evers? And every single person I talked to said yes. What he says, it resonates for Democrats and for that base still so much more than any other candidate, that when he talks about the economy, when he talks about crime, and then when he says, go vote for Tony Evers, go vote for Mandela Barnes, that has more impact than any campaign rally Tony Evers or Mandela Barnes would do on their own.
Well,
There are not many retail politicians like Barack Obama.
Yeah, well,
So,
Obama did win the state twice.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
okay.
I just wanted to jump in real quick. It's really interesting to me. I sort of understand as a political scientist why it happens, but it's interesting to me that at the state level, the election is all about inflation, because there is effectively almost nothing that state level politicians, there are in many ways very little that the president can do, because it's primarily about Jay Powell and the central bank, and about 2/3 of the inflation shock is about the Russia-Ukraine war and supply chains and things like that. So, it is really interesting that yes, it's voters' biggest concern, but also voters are choosing between two parties that effectively neither one has a plan for dealing with inflation at the state level, because the policy levers don't exist.
Okay, well, all right. Well, I'm going to jump ahead here. I mean, so the what you're saying, Mark, is that the election is nationalized here. The midterms are nationalized. Because there doesn't seem to be a specific Wisconsin issue, or am I missing something? Jessie or Matt?
Yep.
I think if you look at crime, I think a lot of Republicans, especially, and Democrats talk about it too, but Milwaukee specifically, I mean, that has become a huge talking point. But it's behind this platform of nationwide crime rising, nationwide crime in huge metro cities like Milwaukee. So, Jeff, to your point, I mean, these are all national races. I asked Glenn Youngkin that the other day, who was in town for Tim Michaels. I said, you're here. Are all of these races national? And he essentially said yes, in terms of even local governors' races at this point. When you look at the money and resources and the talking points and what all the campaigns are talking about, you see similar trend lines and similar storylines.
Right. The Republican, the crime issue for Republicans, it's like cookie cutter, though, around the country. This is, it's what we're hearing here is adapted a little bit to Wisconsin, but it's pretty much the Republican playbook here. Jessie, what's your view on the crime issue and how that is played in the top two races?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Matt. The Milwaukee focus is obviously huge. I think it does resonate. I mean, people can be very motivated by fear. We know that. And, there's there's just, demonstrated evidence. There's a lot of scary things, happening that you can put on TV, and people are afraid of them. I did want to say something else though about the nationalization. I think on the abortion issue, Wisconsin is at least somewhat unique in that we do have the ban. And so there is a little bit more of an immediate effect, or, there's a way that you can make that, apply immediately to voters in a way that if we had, if we were Illinois and there wasn't really a fear that you wouldn't be able to access an abortion, it's possibly a more effective message for Democrats here.
Okay, well,
we know
let's
that
stick with
young
abortion.
voters vote. We know that young voters vote less than older voters, and that's particularly true in midterms. And so, a lot depends on turnout. And so, Jessie is mentioning is if that is something that is mobilizing young voters who weight Democratic and are, likely to be more supportive of abortion rights, then that could be a big shift and something more unique to Wisconsin. But we'd have to see.
Okay, well, has abortion faded as a top motivator, or is it still a very top motivator for Democratic voters, and as you said, Mark, younger voters?
I mean, it's still, looking at the Marquette poll results we were talking about, it's still the number one motivator, right? In a state that is basically divided 50-50, right? So, I think inflation is really important, but this is the most salient issue for the voters of one of the two parties and of the party of the incumbent governor. So, so I think I haven't seen the crosstabs by age, but I suspect there's a lot of interesting variation here, is not just across the parties, but also by age demographics, right? So if you ask people who are, my age in their 40s or older, you're probably going to get the economy and inflation and things like that. And if you ask younger voters, you're going to get a very different rank order. So, and I think that also is probably true across urban-rural divides. And so I think we don't know. The other thing, looking at these charts, just as someone who works with data a lot, is inflation and abortion very much stand out. But then you look at a lot of these numbers and they're very close. And, Charles Franken will be the first to tell you the margin of error on his polls. And so we don't really know what's issue 3 versus 7 that's going to motivate people. And people vote for complicated reasons of like baskets of issues. It's not always just one thing that's driving people to the polls.
Well, right. Okay, I was just going to say, let's start talking about how the campaigns are certain groups of voters that can be selected via whether they watch a certain TV show or or looking at something on social media. So there's a group that are going to be appealed to on climate change from a Democratic point of view, or healthcare. And then, Republicans will target their voters on, crime and taxes and at certain education issues. So, in the whole of a statewide poll, a lot of these issues sort of get washed out, but they are motivators for certain slender groups of voters, right? In the midterms. Yes. Okay, and how
turnout matters in the end, and in Wisconsin elections, it's that are this close, it's about maximizing turnout, and that's one of the things. Just looking around the country, the other nationalization issue is the early voting data numbers in a bunch of states have been very, very high, right? And you don't want to read too much into that because there's lots of ways to vote, and there's partisan weighting. Democrats tend to vote earlier. But kind of one of the few things we know with certainty about American elections is midterm turnout is lower than presidential year turnout. If that's not the case, I don't think anybody knows what the outcome is going to be, because we haven't had an election where midterm turnout is higher than presidential year turnout, I think, ever. And so if it turns out that turnout is basically the same as it was or higher than 2020, our polling models are not equipped to make that a prediction with that level of turnout.
Right. I mean, we could be not, the measurements now could be not taking into account a lot of new registrants, or either same day or before. So, we're kind of going with a known group of voters. So yeah, it's very possible that if there is a big surge in new registrants, and we don't have partisan registration here, but we can track new registration by county. You know, if that emerges, you know, then that could provide a different answer than what the polls are telling us. I guess the polls are telling us it's going to be really close. Yeah, okay, we get that. All right, what is there an issue out there that's a sleeper issue that the polls aren't capturing or that we haven't talked about, or it's like, or is the abortion issue not really about abortion, but individual rights and government interference in your lives? Or, you know, what is the, or is there, do you capture a tone of an issue that seems to be resonating? Jessie?
I mean, I think one thing that we haven't talked about that both parties are concerned about in very different ways is the, you know, the bucket of election integrity and, you know, what that means to different voters. You know, trust in the process on its own, you know, is if it's that close, do we have people disputing the results? I mean, do we not even know, you know, for weeks to come? Does this get tied up in courts for a long time? You know, does it suppress turnout for people who don't trust the system, who, you know, think, you know, why am I participating if I don't think my vote's going to count? I don't know that we've seen a lot of evidence of that happening, but you do have to wonder, you know, the more particularly Republicans hammer on that issue, you know, does that eventually become, you know, a problem for them? And, you know, does it motivate Democrats on the flip side? You know, that was another thing that Obama talked about, but I don't think that Democrats have really spent a lot of time on it, other than, you know, probably Tony Evers and you know, emphasizing the veto power is probably something that plays into that a little bit.
Okay, but Biden talked about this last night and then got panned for it by some Democratic strategists like Axelrod, who used to advise Obama. So I don't know, was Biden acting on motivating a certain class of Democratic voter that I need to get to, or was he just misguided? I don't know.
It's a good question.
Okay, or you should have talked to Axelrod. I don't know, but anyway, I don't know, Matt. What do you?
Yeah,
is there a sleeper issue out there, or what about the election integrity discussion?
I think the election integrity is important. I mean, you look at Republicans, at least in Marquette's poll, that was their number one issue, is confidence in the vote count. And you've seen this push by Republicans in this latest cycle, especially Senator Johnson, to say, all right, go vote early so then you can volunteer to be a poll watcher on election day, to have this buffer of people who can watch the process and perhaps better know how the process works. So when the results do come in, that we can have better confidence and the leaders can say they have better confidence. I was interested that Democrats, it was in the Marquette poll, it was their fourth most important issue over inflation, and likely for different reasons than Republicans, right? So this gets a lot of chatter and a lot of talk. We have this new storyline developing out of Milwaukee just today with the deputy commissioner of the Milwaukee Election Commission requesting military ballots. So it is increasingly top of mind. And I think the perception for both sides becomes reality, right? And what you want this storyline to be. But how this will end and how people will either accept a win or a loss is going to be determined. And I think that's going to dictate how the conversation moves on November 9th.
Well, we had Liz Cheney in Michigan campaigning for a Democratic congressional candidate. So it must be important to some Democratic voters. I
think it's hugely important. I mean, I think it's important to say, look, these are not equally valid concerns. We know mass voter fraud doesn't exist. There's a widespread perception that it does, but the evidence is not there that it exists. You know, so yeah, Democrats' concerns are very much about, you know, safeguarding democracy and, you know, party polarization and, you know, perceptions that the Republican Party has moved further to the right and whatnot. You know, we have decades of data showing that large-scale voter fraud doesn't exist, right? That doesn't mean that people don't believe it is a widespread phenomenon. But, you know, I think there are we were watching around the news this week with the Brazilian election and whether Bolsonaro was going to concede. And I think there are concerns given what happened in December 2020 and then January 6th about kind of both parties accepting the election. So I think that could be a highly motivating issue. I think the other thing, going back to the economy though, is, looking at the Marquette poll and some others, you see inflation is kind of the one thing people are asking about the economy, right? But people could also be concerned about inflation and also generally fear that their household situation is better than it was 2 years ago. We don't really, most of the metrics are not asking people if, we had almost 15% unemployment in mid 2021. And so if you were out of a job and now you're back working, and we know wages, especially in the service sector, have gone up substantially, and monthly job growth has been very strong. So if you're someone who was unemployed and now you're back working at higher wages, you're going to feel very differently about the economy. You still will be unhappy about gas prices, or you'll be unhappy about food prices, but your overall perception of the economy may on balance be positive. And, so I think if there's something missing in the data, it's that in general, people in November of 2022 feel a lot better about the state of the economy than they did in, say, July of 2021.
Right, but they hate the direction of the country and the direction of the state, which seems to be a non sequitur. All right, how much is Biden?
That's almost a constant, though.
And they hate most of the
right.
candidates, right? They hate the candidates
right track,
too.
wrong track. Yeah.
Okay, so how much is Biden an issue?
For Democrats, big. Well, he hasn't been here, right? I mean, it was Obama that they brought in. It was Pete Buttigieg that they brought in. Yeah, Biden was here on Labor Day with Evers, Mandela Barnes, did everything in his power to not stand alongside him or be even near him. I think not only is there a perception, but I think there is some policy concerns among Democrats. In the end, though, right, does any of that make a difference in terms of who's going to the polls? Is a voter going to change their mind because Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden visited or didn't visit the state? I don't know, right? I mean, it helps with enthusiasm, it helps with primary turnout, but in this general, does that have an impact? I don't know. I guess we'll find out, right?
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Jessie.
I sort of think.
Or
go
Mark,
ahead,
go
Jessie.
ahead.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think there were any Democratic candidates here clamoring for Biden to come to town. It's probably to their benefit that he is not here. Bernie Sanders is coming. Obama was huge. Mark said this earlier. There's just not a politician like Barack Obama, right? So that's huge. But I agree with Matt. I'm not sure how much people are actually thinking about that when they're deciding, am I going to vote? Who am I going to vote for? I mean, does it make them a little bit less enthused about things in general? Sure, but is that counteracted by all of these other people coming that they are excited about, or thinking just about the actual candidates that they're voting for? I think that probably is more relevant to the decision.
Yeah, and I think, it's different now in November than if you went back to May or June, when Biden's approval rating was very, very low. And he's back to historical levels of kind of standard over the last 40 years levels of, modest disapproval for an incumbent president in the midterm. So, for political scientists, a lot of this stuff is structural about like the baseline presidential approval rating, the growth rate in the economy, that sort of thing. And we're sort of like, we're back into the normal ranges where I don't think Biden is a huge albatross on Democratic candidates. He's not a huge magnet either. But we're kind of at least going back to the Reagan era now. We're sort of back roughly into, where Clinton was, where Obama was, those sorts of levels.
Okay, Mark. So why are voters so PO'd then?
Midterm
If the
elections,
economy is really good, as you say,
yeah,
better than it was, and
some of it
wages are up, then why are
some of it I think is framing effect and what voters are exposed to. So, again, the sort of relative level of coverage of the recovery versus inflation. If you look and break this down by media outlets and look at, how much, say, Fox News is covering the bad parts of the economy versus the good parts, it's even more pronounced. But again, political scientists focus on like these structural patterns and things over time. And the incumbent president loses votes and his party loses votes during the midterm. And that's sort of everything we're talking about on messaging and turnout and mobilization is kind of around that benchmark, right? And so the benchmark in this election is the Democrats are going to lose seats in both houses of Congress, and it's going to be harder for Democratic incumbents to get reelected. And again, a year ago, the economy was so awful that you would have thought we'd be sitting here and saying a guaranteed red wave, right? To me, what's striking about the election is things have recovered economically so much, and Biden's more popular than he was, that we actually don't know the outcome of the election, right? We're within the margin of error at the national level of an election where Democrats hold one, if not both houses of Congress, which would be, a major deviation from the normal outcome in the midterm. So, so some of it, I think, voters are dissatisfied because when the economy is meh, or when it's sort of parts of it are really bad, people don't like the incumbents. They want to throw out the incumbents, and that's kind of the headwinds all the other stuff about messaging and campaigning is going into.
All right, this is a question that just popped up in my head before we go to audience questions. This is sort of a political science question, though. I've heard this from talking to, casual talking to voters. Well, I want there to be, I don't want one party to control all the government. And I'm thinking, okay, so you're really that's how you're going to make your decision. Is that really a big thing, or am I just talking to the wrong voters, or what?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at the polling, there's at least a chance that you're going to get, granted it's small, but a percentage of voters who would vote for Ron Johnson and Tony Evers. And you could say that's an incumbent factor. You could look at a number of different things. But in a state like Wisconsin, right, that is actually a possibility where maybe 1 to 3 to 4% of voters split their ticket like that. We don't know if that's going to happen, but polling indicates that it could happen.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's likely to be a small. Go ahead, Jessie.
Oh, I was just going to say, Jeff, I don't think you're alone in talking to voters who feel that way. At the same time, I think voters are frustrated by, nothing getting done. And that's, the reason for that is often because one party isn't in control. But I think people do like that idea of there being a check in place.
Yeah, it's a powerful idea in American politics. I think Matt's right. It's probably a very small percentage of the people who are voting primarily based on that. One of the other things we know from research is that most people who say they are independents are not independents, right? In terms of how they actually vote, right? That people say they're independent and I always choose the candidate and not the party. But if you look at how they voted over the last 10 elections, they basically always voted for one party or the other. So I think it's a very small percentage. But again, all of these things if any one of these things about turnout or issue motivation or campaigning, or I like divided government, if 1% of the people vote that way, that can be the thing that's gonna tip the balance. And it'll be hard in the end, and this is not my job, it's Jessie and Matt's job, right? There'll be this sort of, journalists trying to figure out and report on what was the thing that tipped the election. It'll probably be almost impossible to really know because all of these things are flipping on such small margins.
Okay, we mentioned Biden, so now we have to mention Trump too. So so the Republican Party did a great job in 2020 of recruiting new voters out state who would vote for Trump. Trump is not on the ballot, or maybe he is, in a sense. Do those voters, are they motivated to go vote? Because they were casual voters or non-voters who became voters. Trump didn't end up winning, but that is an important constituency for Republicans. Will people vote for Trump? People who voted for Trump vote for somebody not named Trump?
Go ahead, Jessie, but I was going to say, I think first you can look at the 3rd congressional, right? And see how that is going to play out, and the fact that Democrats have essentially pulled every single dollar out of that race. And Derek Van Orden is running on the Trump ticket, so to speak, in an area that's becoming increasingly Republican. It worked in the primary, right? But Trump is not returned for the general. He is in Florida. He is in Iowa. He's in Ohio. He's in Pennsylvania. He's not in Wisconsin. Tim Michaels, who was endorsed by him, was asked about it, I think, last weekend. And he said, listen, Trump does whatever he wants. I don't think he's expected here. We don't need him to win. We're going to do this on our own. So, right, that's the pivot in a state like Wisconsin that Republicans have to make. You embrace it during the primary, and then you just hope those voters stick with you through the general. But I think the third congressional can be an area we can look to see how that plays out, right?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Matt said. I think Trump was a huge factor in the primary. There's no question about that. And is been kind of a non-entity in the general. He's not coming here, and you have his potential rival Ron DeSantis coming here and campaigning for Tim Michaels. So there's interesting dynamics at play, but I do think obviously Derek Van Orden is poised to do pretty well, and you can attribute probably a fair amount of that to the work that Republicans have done in that part of the state over the last few years. And some of that's Trump specific, but some of it's, the idea of Trump, the turn that the party has taken in general.
Yeah, and I think that's what I would say is, I look at the Marquette issue rankings, and to me, Trump is on the ballot, right? So the 4 top issues for Republicans are accurate vote count, inflation, crime, and illegal immigration. I mean, that's Trump's platform in 4 issues, basically. So, in as much as that is what the party and the candidates are campaigning on, and what voters from in the party are saying are the most salient issues, Trump's not there as the guy whose name is on the ballot, but he has shaped the party in 2022, with his platform.
All right, let's go to some audience questions that were sent in, and I'm going to interpret some of these. Okay, so this questioner is outraged by Republicans' plans for putting Social Security and Medicare on the chopping block, and wondering why that isn't more of an issue. So Ron Johnson brought this up himself. I don't think he was even asked about it, and then he tried to explain himself, and a lot of Republican strategists were saying, stop talking. But I don't know, it hasn't seemed to be a big issue. What's going on? Jessie?
Yeah, it hasn't been something that the Democratic candidates here have focused on, but I keep going back to the Obama rally, but he hammered that point really hard. And that was, kind of the takeaway nationally. I mean, people throughout the country were sharing that clip, fixated on that part of the speech more than just about anything else he talked about. So, I do wonder if it is kind of a, like we said earlier, too little too late sort of thing that it hasn't been brought up. But I do think it's effective if you're thinking about, older people who are more likely to vote. They probably should be talking about it a little bit more.
Right, Mark, you said that, right, it's a fact. Older people are more apt to vote, and certainly in midterms. So why isn't it a bigger issue?
Yeah. I mean, I think Matt said something, I think recency bias maybe was the phrase he used earlier. I think to me, that's sort of like, climate change, I know, is a big deal, but the disaster is down the pike and it's very far away. I also think, repealing Social Security, just like until recently, like the idea that sort of abortion law would be fundamentally changed. It's sort of, yes, this is something I care deeply about, but I assign a very low probability to that event. I also think, frankly, in this case, this is something Biden would veto, and the Republicans are not going to have the votes to override it. So I think it's hard for the Democrats to get everybody excited about something where they can say there's lots of things I'm immediately worried about. I'm not worried about in the next 2 years whether or not Joe Biden's going to protect Social Security.
And listen, Senator Johnson has embraced this himself on the campaign trail and in interviews. He brings it up himself in stump speeches in terms of defending his position and the fact that he says he does not want it on the chopping block and that he wants to save Social Security. It's become one of his talking points on the campaign trail and in interviews, and he's freely willing and open to talk about it and defend what he is working to do. Where Democrats didn't bring it up, I think, is enough, as much as some other Democrats would have liked campaigns or candidates to bring it up as an issue. I think politically it's been interesting to watch how the campaigns have taken the issue and tried to take a hold of it themselves.
Well, and that's the thing about Ron Johnson too, is he brings it up himself. You know, everything controversial that he says that, you know, upsets Democrats is something that he doesn't have to be asked about. He's going to bring it up. He's going to lean into the controversy, and he's going to, you know, to Matt's point, defend it, say, no, you know, they're misinterpreting me. They're twisting my words, and I don't want to put it on the chopping block. You know, we have to, you know, change it, burn it down, whatever to save it.
All right. This questioner wonders about polarization and, I guess wishing for a less intense D versus R atmosphere, and whether that is an issue in how we view a candidate or a campaign. Like Tony Evers is more apolitical than probably anybody on the top of the ticket. So, but is that an advantage? Is that a good issue, or a good issue for certain politicians only? Or I guess maybe that's a stylistic question. I don't know, Matt.
I think in 2018 it worked for Tony Evers, right, by 1.1%. Whether that still works now, I mean, look at the TV ads. Like, just look at the cycle and how each candidate tried to define their opponent. It was a little bit in the beginning about themselves, introducing themselves, and I haven't seen too many coming home TV ads in the last couple of days. Maybe we're going to pivot. Usually, right in the final couple of days, it's the fields and flowers and roses and I love you and I'm going to do everything for you. But it is still attack, attack, attack. And they're doing it for a reason, because it works, right? Republicans say they were able to define Mandela Barnes for a lot of people who didn't know him, and that's why we're in this position in terms of the TV ads. But man, the polarization, I think it's more so from the campaigns, and I think there's a good segment of voters who are just like this person who asked the question, who yes, have political motivations and thoughts and ideas, but like this constant going after each other is just so sickening to a lot of people. I think there's a good segment out there that feel that way.
Or the people who say, I hate the ads, I hate negative ads, but then they pay attention to the negative ads. So, okay.
Did you hear what this person did? Yeah.
I mean, everyone hates negative ads, but they work. I mean, that's why we have them. And like, radical is the word of this campaign, right? It's a race for each party to, define which candidate is the most radical. And
right.
Happy to never hear that word again after November 8th.
Right. If this were a drinking game, we wouldn't be able to continue. All right.
And look, these aren't new. I'm old enough to remember Willie Horton and Michael Dukakis, and this is a structural feature of American politics, right? And we have a majoritarian two-party winner-take-all type of system, and if we want less polarization, then things like Alaska is starting to adopt ranked choice voting, and there's lots of sort of democracy reforms of our institutions that we can have for less polarization, but we never see that, right? We hear all this about voters being dissatisfied and they don't like the nastiness and the division and the polarization, but candidates and parties aren't running on like reforming American democratic institutions, so we'll have less of that. Right? And
right.
Sort of in any one election, nobody has an incentive to do that, which means the polarization kind of keeps continuing every election.
All right, here's a question out there. The Supreme Court decision essentially outlawed abortions in Wisconsin, and it doesn't really matter in the election. Act 10 seemed to kick up way more dust. That's a provocative statement, but Jessie, go take that one.
Well, I think there's probably something to be said about going back to the Social Security issue. It's maybe not as immediate to some people. If you haven't personally experienced this, if you haven't had someone close to you experience it, or had to think about it, it's not a today problem. It's well, that probably isn't something I'm ever going to have to deal with kind of problem. So maybe that doesn't motivate people as much. I wasn't covering, I guess, elections exactly during Act 10. It kind of started right after that, so I can't really, I don't personally have a great comparison on that. That is a provocative statement.
I mean, I again would just say, I don't think we want to overestimate that abortion hasn't become an issue because it is the single biggest issue motivating Democratic voters, right? And that's sort of what the polls are saying. So if there's going to be a wave of Democratic turnout and there's a wave of young people turning out, it's going to be primarily because of abortion. And we don't know if that's going to happen, but I think, we don't want to sort of say it's not happening and rule it out, because it's quite possible if Democratic turnout is really high and turns out to be higher than Republican turnout, that is what will have motivated it.
I also think it's not just a young voter issue. I mean, there are a lot of women who remember, the decision, who remember what it was like before, abortion was legal. And, I certainly talked to a lot of them immediately after the Dobbs decision, and they were really motivated. They were upset. They could think about not wanting to go back to, something that they've already experienced. So, I think it's not just a question of young voters.
Well, and look at the evolution of Tim Michaels, for example, just on his position from no exceptions for rape or incest to recently saying he would sign legislation that had exceptions for rape and incest. The evolution of that comes from Republicans knowing that this is an important issue as well. Whether for Democrats it's big enough to get enough people to the polls, Republicans know it's an issue as well, and they see the public polling in terms of exceptions and Wisconsin's law and the uniqueness of the abortion issue in this state, Jessie, as you pointed to earlier. But I mean, Democrats really tried to make it an issue. Mandela Barnes, it was like a week straight that he only had rallies and issues on abortion, working to highlight some of those stories. So, in the end, whether that will be a top issue or not, I guess we may find out in exit polling or who knows.
Yeah, and Jessie's point is really good. I haven't seen the gender breakdown in the Marquette poll, but there's a huge gender divide right now in terms of support for Democrats and Republicans. And so if female voters turn out 5% more than male voters turn out, that's going to be a huge swing. That's sort of it. Women turning out in the suburbs around big cities is what tipped the election in 2020 for Biden. Right. So if you see something like that again, you probably have a similar result.
I'm also struck by the referendum in Kansas that which is a pretty conservative state, even though it has a Democratic governor. But I've read about how the activists who won that were not even talking about abortion to a lot of people. They were talking about individual rights. And I haven't heard or seen so much of that argument here from Democrats or abortion rights activists, because that would seem to include those who same-sex marriage rights, or take your pick. So I'm wondering, that seems to be a nuance of an issue that hasn't really been spun out a lot here in Wisconsin, or has it? And I missed it.
No, I think you're right. I think Democrats have framed it much more as a healthcare issue than an individual rights issue. But I do think there were, in the immediate days after, the Dobbs decision, there were some efforts to kind of tie it to things like interracial marriage or same-sex marriage because of, the concurring opinion that raised those issues. I don't think it stuck very well as a message, but it was certainly something that was talked about.
Okay, so this is a question about the GOP assembly. And what are your projections about Representative Voss continuing as speaker? Well, I think what's going to happen? I mean, there's a different prediction. Well, first of all, is Voss going to win his race against 2 write-ins?
I think if I had to put money on it, he'll be fine. And he'll probably continue as speaker. I'm curious to find out whether Republicans can get a supermajority, and it seems like it's not out of the realm of possibility for them to do that.
Right. We should educate listeners or viewers in case they don't know, the Republicans are trying to get a supermajority in the legislature, not just control both houses, since looks like they're going to control both houses. So they would need a 2/3 majority in both houses to override vetoes. if Evers is reelected. If Michaels is elected, well, then that won't matter so much, I suppose. Maybe we ought to little talk about, the state issues, the veto issue, and how that might play. Democrats are, really going to the wall and to make sure that this doesn't happen in the state assembly, because that's where it would have to happen, probably. Matt, you want to sort of take a stab at that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, the governor has seemed to try to hit on this in some aspects on the campaign trail, right? That he is the last line of defense, so to speak, in terms of whether it be the election legislation or what is it, Jessie, 140 plus bills he vetoed. So whether take your issue or take your pick, that he is in a sense framed it as, if I am not reelected, that line of defense for Democrats or for independents will no longer be there. And the supermajority question gets a little wonky, right, for your average voter. So, and maybe this is being honed in a little more locally in the state Senate or state assembly districts. But there hasn't been a very large conversation about the potential for a supermajority and what that could mean if Evers is reelected. It might just be one of those things that on November 9th, everyone's like, oh, wow, supermajority. Okay, so, it might be something hard to grasp on how to message on the campaign trail.
Well, it's obviously important.
It could go one of two ways. If there was a Republican supermajority, be drastic policy change. The legislature refused to let Tony Evers staff the government, and so you have most of the Board of Regents for the UW system is acting, and you sort of have the DNR appointees and whatnot, and so suddenly massive change in personnel could lead to massive policy change. But the other is you're sort of calling the party's bluff then, and there's a series of very drastic policy changes, like a total abortion ban, right? Sort of, not having the 1849 law, but codifying that in a new updated law, which they could do. But if the polls are to be believed, are things that are unpopular with about 65 to 70% of the electorate, right? So and that's again that recency bias we were talking about. If it suddenly looks like those things really are going to happen, just like at the national level, if we were debating in Congress repealing Social Security, wonder if a lot of Republicans would start to say, wait a second, that was good to campaign on, but I really didn't mean to follow through on passing those policies. Right. I don't have a good sense of which one of those we would end up in, but they're both possibilities.
Right. You're suggesting there would be if there were a Republican state house or they had a supermajority, there would be self-restraint in the legislature to not pass bills that were wildly unpopular, right? Right? That's what you're saying.
So it's possible, but they may be unpopular with the median voter, but if they're popular with the party, then you're in a bit more of a bind because you're not talking in the abstract anymore. You have constituents who really want you to do this. But you're running in a 50-50 state where you're trying to win elections. And, at the assembly level, there's a lot of gerrymandering and in the Senate too, but that becomes a problem then for if Michaels is governor and is running in a statewide race.
I think Tommy Thompson used to tell the Republican legislature when he had it for a few years, don't send me an abortion bill.
Yeah.
He didn't want to have to deal with that. But anyway. Okay, now this question is centered on why isn't why aren't environmental issues? Why isn't climate change more of an issue? Why aren't that does not seem to be a big issue that Democrats are pushing, even though they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot of pro-environmental stuff in it. What's going on there, Matt?
That's a good question. Among Democratic voters, climate change is one of the top issues. Among Republican voters, it's at the bottom of the list. So there's a huge disparity in terms of where you are on the political spectrum on how urgent you think the climate change issue is. And clearly there's been a calculation, at least among Democrats, because they know their voters care about it, to at least mention it. I've heard passing mentions of climate change and clean water issues, but that's about the extent of it. They've decided to hone in on other more prevalent messages. And Republicans know that among their base, among Republican voters, is at the near bottom of their list. So to talk about it doesn't do them any political good, at least given in the current political environment. Jessie, you can take a shot at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mark mentioned it earlier, that it's something that is, easy enough to think, well, I don't have to deal with that. It's also, I don't know how much this factors in, but a lot of policies and solutions to fighting climate change involve personal sacrifice and things that we don't really enjoy doing. You don't want to use less electricity, you don't want to stop driving your comfortable car around, and so it's not exactly like the easiest thing to message, because a lot of those policies are asking you to take it upon yourselves to change the way that you live your life.
Okay, so now we're coming to a close, and I'm going to ask you all for your predictions. No, I'm not asking you. I'm not going to do that, Jessie. Okay, I'm going to ask. So, what are you going to be looking for on election night? Either for a cue on. I think Mark centered on something there. What's that vote in the wild counties? What's going on there? Is there a drop? So what are some of the things you're going to look at on Tuesday and Wednesday to give your telltale sign that X issue was a winner or not a winner?
I think the counties are huge, the WOW counties and the BOW counties. So we've got the Brown, Outagamie, Winnebago section of the state that has been increasingly influential. And having that congressional race, I think the third, does that really drive Republicans, at a statewide level? I guess those are kind of the parts of the state that I'll be watching. I'm not sure, I think it's going to be really difficult for us to figure out which issues really motivated voters unless there's a really clear, win margin, which I just don't think we're going to have. It's if Republicans were to win by 3 or 4 points, and we could easily say, yeah, abortion really wasn't a factor. It was all about inflation. It was maybe a little bit about crime. I can't imagine we're going to have such a definitive result that we can walk away with a lot of really good insight. I think it's going to be, we're going to have to talk to a lot of voters. We're going to have to, do the tough reporting afterward to find out what was really driving people. And I'm just hoping that maybe we know the results by the next day. Like, that'd be cool.
We might not know who controls the U.S. Senate for sure. Yeah, it could go on for a while.
Yeah, and it could be a Walker-Warnock runoff is determining it again.
Right.
So, I mean, for me, it's the things we were talking about the composition of the level and composition of turnout. Right. So if women are turning out more than men and young voters are turning out in levels that are much higher than traditional midterm levels, right, then that will be a sign that, not only I think that abortion was sort of a key motivator, but just sort of that the Democrats are probably better. And if you see things turning in the other direction, then it'll go in the other direction.
And if city of Milwaukee, if their turnout is high compared to another midterm, that would be another sign, I would assume. Yeah. Go ahead there, Matt.
Yeah, everything you guys just said. The northwestern, the WOW counties, obviously the northwestern portion of the state, if Republicans turn out and vote Republican like they have for Trump, if that is a trend that's continuing that we've seen, even over the last decade, the erosion of the Democratic vote in that region, if it's still at those high levels, and the city of Milwaukee, there's been a lot of focus. I mean, there was a reason former President Obama was in Milwaukee, right? There's a huge attempt to mobilize the vote here in the city. And I think Democrats are still a bit unknown on whether that enthusiasm in the city is going to produce the turnout that they need, to be honest, that they need in the city of Milwaukee to be competitive.
All right. Well, that was a great discussion. It was fun. Thanks. You're a good panelist, and that makes it easy on the not so great host. All right. So thank you, Mark, Jessie, and Matt. we'll see you on election night and thereafter. So maybe we'll do this again sometime. Really appreciate it. Good luck in what you'll be doing on election day. All right. So I want to thank ARP Wisconsin for being the sponsor of this virtual event. We really appreciate it. We do most of our events in person these days again, but we're happy to do occasional virtual events and get a more statewide audience. So thank you for tuning in, folks. Really appreciate it. Want to remind you that to go to WisPolitics.com, look at our virtual election guide, and to be there on election night and the day after to follow results. And remember our November 10 event at UW-Milwaukee on the election results. Well, that's it for right now. Thank you for tuning in. This has been Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com, and we'll see you later.